So tonight on the project, in a TV first, we're going to show you how rich you are compared to the rest of the country. We've got a new analysis that shows where you compare when it comes to your wealth. And the information might surprise you. Now, first of all, we're talking about wealth, not income. Wealth is the money you have, not the money you earn. And it's pretty easy to get a ballpark idea of your own wealth. It's just your assets minus your debts. You might want to write some notes down here. We're going to go to the break in a second so you can do all the maths. But start by adding up everything you own. It's okay if you do this as an individual or as a couple. You can start with your house or houses, your car, furniture, electronics, bank accounts, KiwiSaver and investments. Add all that up and then you need to subtract any debts like a mortgage, a student loan, a car loan or a credit card. Here's an example. Say your house is worth $1 million, you add your car at $20,000, maybe you got $80,000 in KiwiSaver, that's going to add up to $1.1 million. Then subtract your mortgage, that might be $600,000, and your car loan at $10,000, a student loan at say $20,000. And the sum, the final number, $470,000. That's your number, that's your wealth. So take a couple of minutes now to jot down those numbers and add it all up for you. There's actually a different data set for households. We're going to put that up on Facebook later. But for now, if you've done this as a couple, just divide the number in half to get your own number. And by the way, it's okay if your number is negative, if you owe more than you own. There are plenty of New Zealanders like that. So we're going to go to the break and I'll be back shortly to show you a new analysis of where you sit compared to the rest of New Zealand. Now, a few minutes ago we showed you how to figure out your wealth. You add up everything you own and subtract everything you owe. And now we're going to show you a new analysis of where you are compared to everyone else. Remember, these are individual numbers, so if you're sharing your assets with a partner, for now just divide your number in half. And we've rounded these numbers a little bit so they're easy to work with on TV. So take a look. If your wealth is less than zero, you're in the lowest 10% of New Zealanders. If it's between $0 and $4,000, you're in the next 10%. In the middle here, between $39,000 and $92,000, that's about in the middle of the pack, and all the way at the top of the rankings, if you have more than $860,000, congratulations, you're in the wealthiest 10%. There are another couple of numbers I'd like to point out. First, that bottom 10% is in a collective $13 billion of debt. And the top 10% has $800 billion in wealth. That's more than the other 90% combined. And of course, New Zealand's unusual in the world in that we don't tax this money at all. Now, to help us figure out what this all means, I spoke to inequality researcher Max Rashbrook. He crunched these numbers, and I asked him what his first thoughts were when he saw these numbers.
To me, it just really showed me, though, that we're not the egalitarian country that we think we are. You know, there are these really massive disparities, and there are kids growing up in these families at either end of the spectrum who are obviously going to have completely different opportunities. And you think, well, all those ideas that I like to cling on to, that people like to cling on to about this being an egalitarian country, it just doesn't seem like that anymore.
We're often told that economic growth is good for all of us here in New Zealand. Is that true?
The idea that economic growth benefits everyone, I guess, is a variant on that sort of trickle-down theory. If the wealthy get wealthier, that'll trickle down to everyone else. And what we've seen is that doesn't really happen. I mean, if you look at incomes in the last, sort of 30 or 40 years, incomes have doubled for the richest New Zealanders, but they've barely increased for the poorest New Zealanders. In fact, after housing costs, the poorest New Zealanders have less disposable income now than they did in the 1980s. So you can't just rely on economic growth to get us out of these problems, I think.
Okay, so if not economic growth, what sort of policies do work to reduce inequality? What can we do about it?
Well, look, I think you'd have to do something in housing. Housing is a huge component of people's wealth, so solving the housing crisis would go a long way to addressing these inequalities. I'd like to see some encouragement for savings for poorer families, something like a kids KiwiSaver to help boost the savings of poorer kids who would otherwise not, have an asset base building up behind them. I'd like to see wealth shared more evenly within companies, so a lot more programs that create share ownership for employees. And I also think you could fund a lot of these initiatives through a wealth tax, just a small sort of 1% levy on the largest fortunes, maybe those over $2 million or over $4 million. I think if you put those things together, you'd be starting to make a real dent in the levels of inequality that we see.
Well, Max Rashbrook, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.